Emmanuel Antonio Littlejohn's life was a testament to the complexities of justice, accountability, and redemption. Born in Oklahoma City, his early years were marred by poverty and a turbulent family life, circumstances that laid the groundwork for a life of struggle and poor decisions. In 1992, at just 20 years old, Emmanuel became embroiled in a robbery that ended in tragedy. The incident claimed the life of a store owner and led to Littlejohn's death sentence. For over 3 decades, his case sparked debates about fairness, the death penalty, and the capacity for change. This story delves into the events of that fateful day, the trial, his years on death row, and the moral and legal questions his case raised. Emmanuel Antonio Littlejohn's early years were shaped by challenges that seemed insurmountable from the start. Born in the economically disadvantaged neighborhoods of Oklahoma City, Emmanuel was one of 4 children in a household marked by instability and hardship. His mother, a single parent for much of his childhood, worked tirelessly to provide for her family, often holding down multiple low-paying jobs. Despite her efforts, the family lived below the poverty line, frequently relying on food assistance programs and the generosity of extended family to make ends meet. The scarcity of resources created a volatile environment, one where love was abundant but survival came first. The neighborhood where Emmanuel grew up was plagued by systemic neglect and violence. Unemployment rates were high, and opportunities for young people to escape the cycle of poverty were few and far between. Drug use and gang activity were pervasive, and Emmanuel, like many of his peers, found himself drawn to the streets for camaraderie and a sense of belonging. The community, while resilient in many ways, was a difficult place for a young boy to find his footing. Schools were underfunded, with overcrowded classrooms and overworked teachers unable to provide the individualized attention that students like Emmanuel needed. Early on, it became clear that Emmanuel struggled academically. Teachers noted that he was bright but distracted, often daydreaming or acting out in class, behaviors that were likely cries for attention and structure. At home, Emmanuel's situation was equally challenging. His father was largely absent, a shadowy figure who appeared sporadically but never stayed long enough to build a meaningful relationship. Without a consistent male role model, Emmanuel relied on older boys in the neighborhood to guide him, many of whom were already entrenched in criminal activities. His mother, overwhelmed by the demands of raising 4 children alone, did her best to instill discipline, but often had to make tough choices between working long hours and being present for her kids. This absence of supervision left Emmanuel and his siblings to fend for themselves, navigating the dangers of their environment with little guidance. By the time Emmanuel reached his teenage years, his path was already diverging from the opportunities he had once envisioned for himself. He harbored dreams of becoming a mechanic, a profession he associated with stability and respectability. As a child, he would often watch the local mechanic work on cars, fascinated by the process of dismantling and rebuilding machines. Yet dreams have a way of fading when reality presses hard against them. The pressures of adolescence, coupled with the lure of easy money and status from petty crime, led Emmanuel astray. What began as minor infractions, shoplifting and skipping school, soon escalated to more serious offenses. Arrested for the first time at the age of 15 for stealing a bicycle, Emmanuel's entry into the juvenile justice system marked the beginning of a long and tumultuous relationship with law enforcement. Despite his troubles, there were glimpses of the person Emmanuel could have been under different circumstances. Neighbors described him as polite and eager to help, often offering to carry groceries or fix small items for elderly residents. His younger siblings looked up to him, and Emmanuel took his role as their protector seriously, often going without to ensure they had enough. There were moments of joy, too, playing basketball at the local park, laughing with friends, and dreaming of a future far removed from the chaos that surrounded him. But these moments were fleeting, overshadowed by the harsh realities of his daily life. A significant turning point came when Emmanuel dropped out of high school at the age of 17. Struggling academically and feeling increasingly disconnected from the structured environment of school, he decided to leave and seek work to help support his family. However, with no diploma and limited skills, legitimate job opportunities were scarce. Emmanuel found himself doing odd jobs, landscaping, cleaning, and occasionally working at car repair shops, but the pay was meager and inconsistent. The frustration of watching his mother continue to struggle, coupled with his own inability to break free from poverty, pushed him further toward a life of crime. Emmanuel's descent into criminal activity was gradual but steady. By his late teens, he was spending more time with a group of friends who were involved in theft and drug dealing. These older peers introduced him to a world where money could be made quickly, albeit at great personal and legal risk. Emmanuel, desperate to contribute financially and weary of watching his family suffer, began participating in minor robberies. Though he initially justified his actions as a means to an end, the thrill of the hustle and the temporary relief it brought made it increasingly difficult for him to walk away. His mother, aware of the path her son was taking, pleaded with him to change. She warned him of the dangers of the streets, reminding him of the friends he had already lost to violence or incarceration. Emmanuel would listen, sometimes tearfully promising to do better, but the pull of his environment was strong. Each time he tried to step away, financial pressures or the influence of his peers would draw him back in. By the time Emmanuel turned 20, his life was a delicate balance of hope and despair. He still dreamed of turning things around, of finding steady work, moving his family to a safer neighborhood, and building a future where his siblings wouldn't have to endure the struggles he had faced. Yet he also felt trapped, a young man caught between his aspirations and the harsh realities of his circumstances. It was this sense of desperation and disillusionment that set the stage for the fateful events of 1992, a moment that would define the rest of his life and ultimately seal his fate. The night of July 3, 1992 began like any other for Emmanuel Antonio Littlejohn, but it would end as the night that forever changed his life. At just 20 years old, Emmanuel was struggling to find a way out of the cycle of poverty that had gripped him since childhood. That summer, desperation loomed over him like a shadow. Bills were piling up, his younger siblings were in need, and the odd jobs he picked up barely provided enough to survive. It was during this time of despair that Emmanuel fell deeper into the company of Glenn Bethany, a friend whose influence would prove disastrous. Glenn was older, charismatic, and deeply embedded in a world of petty crime and fast money. To Emmanuel, Glenn seemed confident, a man who had figured out how to beat the system. That night, Glenn proposed what he described as a quick and easy plan: robbing the Root and Scoot convenience store. The store, located in a quiet part of Oklahoma City, was known to close late, and Glenn had heard rumors that it often had a decent amount of cash in the register after the day's business. To Emmanuel, the idea was nerve-wracking but tempting. He was hesitant. Armed robbery was a far cry from the minor thefts he had committed in the past, but Glenn reassured him that it would be simple. In and out, Glenn promised. No one gets hurt. As the two men drove to the store, Emmanuel's heart raced. He had never handled a firearm before, but Glenn handed him a pistol, insisting it was just for intimidation. The plan was straightforward. They would enter the store, demand the money, and leave before anyone had a chance to react. Despite Glenn's casual demeanor, Emmanuel felt a gnawing sense of unease. He considered backing out, but the weight of his financial struggles and the fear of looking weak in front of Glenn kept him in the car. The Root and Scoot was a small family-owned business run by Kenneth Mears and his wife. Kenneth was known for his friendly demeanor, often chatting with customers and offering free coffee to regulars. That night, Kenneth was working late, as he often did, when Emmanuel and Glenn walked through the door. The sight of the two young men immediately put Kenneth on edge. Glenn, who was leading, barked at Kenneth to hand over the money while Emmanuel lingered near the door, trying to look intimidating but feeling paralyzed by fear. The atmosphere inside the store was tense. Kenneth hesitated, his instincts telling him to protect his business but also recognizing the danger he faced. As Glenn grew more aggressive, yelling and pointing his weapon, Emmanuel felt the situation slipping out of control. He wanted to tell Glenn to stop, to leave before things escalated, but his voice seemed stuck in his throat. Kenneth, trying to defuse the situation, reached for the cash register, but his movements were slow and deliberate, perhaps too slow for Glenn's liking. In the chaos of the moment, everything happened in a blur. Kenneth, perhaps emboldened by fear or desperation, made a sudden move toward the phone on the counter, likely intending to call for help. Glenn reacted instantly, shouting at Kenneth to stop. The next sound was deafening. A gunshot rang out, piercing the tense silence of the store. Kenneth collapsed behind the counter, clutching his chest as blood pooled around him. Emmanuel stood frozen, his ears ringing and his mind racing. He didn't remember pulling the trigger, but the gun in his hand felt heavy and foreign, as if it had acted on its own. Glenn grabbed the cash from the register, yelling at Emmanuel to move, but Emmanuel could barely register his words. They fled the store in a panic, the cash stuffed hastily into Glenn's backpack. Emmanuel, still in shock, sat silently in the passenger seat as Glenn sped away. The reality of what had just happened began to sink in. A man was dead, and he was complicit. Back at Glenn's apartment, the two argued heatedly. Emmanuel insisted that he hadn't fired the shot, that the gun had gone off accidentally, or that Glenn had been the one to pull the trigger. Glenn, however, was adamant that Emmanuel was responsible. Their friendship, already tenuous, fractured under the weight of blame and guilt. The aftermath of the robbery was swift. Police were called to the scene and quickly began piecing together evidence from witness statements and security footage. It wasn't long before Emmanuel and Glenn were identified as suspects. A tip from an acquaintance, perhaps lured by the promise of a reward, led to their arrest just days later. When police stormed Glenn's apartment, they found the stolen cash and the weapon used in the crime, further sealing their fate. For Emmanuel, the weight of what had happened was unbearable. In the days leading up to his arrest, he barely ate or slept, haunted by the image of Kenneth's lifeless body and the sound of the gunshot that seemed to echo endlessly in his mind. He replayed the events over and over, trying to convince himself that it was all a mistake, that he hadn't meant for anyone to get hurt. But no matter how he rationalized it, the reality remained. A man was dead, and he was part of the reason why. When police questioned Emmanuel, he initially denied involvement, hoping to shield himself from the full weight of the law. However, under the pressure of interrogation and the mounting evidence against him, he eventually confessed to his role in the robbery. Still, he maintained that he had not fired the fatal shot, pointing the finger at Glenn. Glenn, for his part, told a different story, claiming that Emmanuel had been the one to shoot Kenneth. Their conflicting accounts would later become a central issue in their trial, leaving jurors to decide who was telling the truth. The events of that night marked the beginning of a long and painful journey for Emmanuel. What had started as a desperate attempt to escape poverty had spiraled into a nightmare from which there was no escape. As he sat in his jail cell, awaiting the legal proceedings that would determine his fate, Emmanuel was left to grapple with the weight of his choices and the devastating consequences they had wrought. Emmanuel Antonio Littlejohn's trial for the murder of Kenneth Mears was a highly charged, dramatic legal proceeding that garnered significant attention, not just for the heinous nature of the crime, but for the questions it raised about justice, the fairness of the criminal justice system, and the ethics of the death penalty. By the time the trial began in 1993, Emmanuel had spent months in jail, reflecting on the events that had led him to that point and attempting to make sense of what had happened. His defense, led by a public defender who had limited resources and experience with capital cases, was prepared to argue that Emmanuel had not intended to kill anyone, that he had been manipulated and coerced into the crime by his older accomplice, Glenn Bethany. From the outset, the prosecution presented a strong case, driven by the brutal fact of Kenneth Mears' death. The jury was shown graphic photos of Kenneth's body, blood staining the floor where he had collapsed after being shot in the chest. They heard testimony from witnesses who had been in the store at the time of the robbery, providing harrowing accounts of the chaos that had unfolded in those few minutes. Several of these witnesses were able to identify Emmanuel and Glenn as the two men who had entered the store, pointed guns, and demanded money. This testimony was pivotal, for it established that Emmanuel was indeed present at the scene of the crime and played an active role in the robbery. But the central issue in Emmanuel's case was the identity of the person who fired the fatal shot. The prosecution argued that it was Emmanuel who had pulled the trigger, pointing to the fact that he had been the one holding the gun when the robbery escalated into violence. In their eyes, it didn't matter whether the shooting had been intentional or not. The fact that Emmanuel had been armed and actively involved in the robbery made him responsible for the consequences of that crime. The prosecution painted Emmanuel as a cold, calculating young man who had made the conscious decision to rob a store and, when confronted with resistance, had killed the victim in cold blood. For Emmanuel, this was a bitter pill to swallow. He had never wanted to hurt anyone. He had only gone along with Glenn's plan out of a sense of desperation and misplaced loyalty. In his mind, the idea that he could be blamed for a death he never intended was something that gnawed at him throughout the trial. His defense team sought to undermine the prosecution's theory, offering an alternate narrative, that it was Glenn who had fired the fatal shot, not Emmanuel. They argued that Emmanuel had been overwhelmed by fear, that he was not in control of the situation, and that the shooting had been an accident, a tragic consequence of a robbery gone horribly wrong. One of the key pieces of evidence in the trial was the conflicting testimony of the two men involved in the crime. Emmanuel maintained that he had never intended for anyone to be killed, let alone shot a man in cold blood. He insisted that Glenn had been the one to pull the trigger, that he had been caught off guard by the sudden escalation of violence. But Glenn's testimony contradicted this, and his version of events was critical in shaping the jury's perception of the case. Glenn, who had already been arrested and was facing charges of his own, claimed that it was Emmanuel who had shot Kenneth. He said that Emmanuel had been the one to lose control, the one who had made the decision to escalate the robbery into murder. The conflict between the two men was impossible to resolve completely, as each one's story was at odds with the other's, and there was no clear forensic evidence to point to the true shooter. The defense's argument was not without merit. Emmanuel's supporters pointed to his background, his history of struggle, and his lack of criminal intent. They argued that he had been a victim of his circumstances, trapped by a life of poverty, poor decisions, and the influence of older, more dangerous individuals like Glenn. Emmanuel's lawyers called witnesses who testified about his character, about the young man they had known before the robbery. They spoke of his kindness, his potential, and the fact that he had never been involved in violent crime before. They contended that the shooting had been a spur-of-the-moment act, driven by fear and a desire to escape a dangerous situation. But the prosecution dismissed these arguments, arguing that Emmanuel's role in the robbery and the violence that followed could not be excused. They painted a picture of a young man who had made a series of bad decisions, each of which led him closer to a tragic outcome. The fact that he had participated in a robbery at all, they argued, showed a disregard for the law and for human life. The fact that he had been holding the gun made him responsible for whatever happened next. In their eyes, Emmanuel had chosen his path, and there was no way to absolve him of the consequences. As the trial wore on, it became clear that the issue of whether Emmanuel had fired the fatal shot was not going to be easily resolved. The jury had to consider not just the physical evidence, but also the moral question of whether Emmanuel could be held accountable for a death that had, in his view, been an accident. The conflicting testimonies of the two men, each pointing the finger at the other, left the jury with a difficult decision to make. Emmanuel's defense team urged them to consider his history, his character, and his lack of violent intent. But the prosecution's case was compelling, and the evidence of the robbery and the shooting painted a damning picture. The trial culminated in a conviction, with the jury finding Emmanuel guilty of first-degree murder and sentencing him to death. The verdict was met with mixed reactions. Some saw it as a just outcome, a necessary punishment for the senseless killing of a man who had been going about his business. Others, including those who had supported Emmanuel during the trial, felt that the punishment was too severe given the circumstances. They argued that Emmanuel had never intended to kill anyone, that he had been a young man caught up in a tragic set of circumstances, and that the death penalty was an unjust response to what had been, at worst, a crime of reckless negligence. For Emmanuel, the guilty verdict was a devastating blow. The weight of the conviction and the knowledge that he had just been sentenced to die for his role in the robbery were almost too much to bear. In the days following the trial, he wrestled with the reality of his situation. The enormity of what had happened, how one poor decision had led to such a catastrophic outcome, filled him with regret and despair. He thought about Kenneth Mears, the man whose life had been taken in the blink of an eye, and wondered if there was any way he could have changed the course of events. But for Emmanuel, the justice system had already spoken, and the path to the death chamber seemed inevitable. His case, like so many others before and after it, highlighted the deep complexities of crime, punishment, and the human condition. For over 3 decades, Emmanuel Antonio Littlejohn lived in the shadow of death, confined to a cell on death row in the Oklahoma State Penitentiary. His life behind bars became a slow unraveling of both time and identity. With each passing day, he wrestled with the gravity of his actions and the consequences that followed, as well as the emotional burden of knowing that his future was uncertain, hinging entirely on the whims of an unforgiving legal system. Initially, Emmanuel was consumed by the weight of his conviction. The trial had been a whirlwind, and in the early months following his sentencing, he found himself overwhelmed by guilt and confusion. The thought of the victim, Kenneth Mears, whose life he had unintentionally ended, haunted him. He replayed the robbery over and over in his mind, analyzing the moments leading up to the fatal shot, wondering if there was something, anything that he could have done differently. His remorse was immediate, but the reality of the death sentence overshadowed any hope for redemption. At first, it felt as though the walls of his cell were closing in on him, the certainty of his fate making each day feel heavier than the last. Life on death row, however, was not simply defined by a looming sentence. It was a brutal existence, one marked by isolation, routine, and a constant reminder of the finality of one's life. Emmanuel's days began early, as the prison bell rang to signal the start of another 24 hours. His cell was small, sparsely furnished with only the bare essentials: a cot, a small desk, and a toilet. The walls, drab and gray, were a constant reminder of the life he had left behind, a life filled with potential and possibility that now seemed out of reach. Visitors were rare, and communication with the outside world was limited to letters and brief phone calls, which further isolated him from the people who might have offered him the emotional support he desperately needed. For the first few years, Emmanuel existed in a state of numbness. The realization that he would die in prison hung over him like a cloud, blocking out any hope of a future beyond the prison walls. He had little to occupy his time, no activities to distract him from the fact that his life had essentially been paused, suspended in the cruel purgatory of death row. But as the years wore on, he began to search for meaning in the monotony, trying to make sense of his existence in a place where time seemed to stand still. It was during this period of internal reflection that Emmanuel started to write. He had always enjoyed expressing himself through words, but had never taken the time to develop that skill before. Prison, however, provided him with the time and solitude to explore his thoughts in a way that he never had in the outside world. At first, his writing was a means of coping, a way to process the endless cycles of regret and despair that consumed him. He began by writing letters to his family, expressing his sorrow and remorse, and later to various advocacy groups that worked with the death row inmates. His letters, heartfelt and raw, revealed a man struggling to reconcile the person he had been with the person he now was. As the years passed, Emmanuel's writing became more focused. He began to pen personal essays, short stories, and even poetry, attempting to make sense of his past and his present. Writing allowed him to confront the darkest parts of himself, the violence, the choices, and the consequences, and in doing so, he found a way to hold himself accountable without succumbing entirely to guilt. Through his writing, he could process the chaos of his emotions, working through the layers of anger, shame, and sadness that weighed him down. He also began to correspond with other inmates, forming connections with people who were similarly grappling with their own guilt and regrets. In this shared space of pain, they found a sense of solidarity, a reminder that they were not entirely alone, even within the walls of their solitary existence. Perhaps more surprisingly, Emmanuel began to find a sense of peace within himself. As he entered his second decade on death row, he came to terms with the reality that he would likely die in prison. He no longer fixated on the outcome of his appeals, but instead focused on what he could control: the thoughts he allowed to consume him, the relationships he could still nurture through his letters, and the ways he could contribute to others even in his limited circumstances. He became active in prison education programs, offering advice to younger inmates and encouraging them to use their time behind bars for self-improvement. Though he had made mistakes in his past, he now saw the importance of redemption, how it was possible to become something better, even when society had already condemned him. One of the most important parts of Emmanuel's life on death row was his spiritual journey. Initially, faith was something distant, a concept that seemed irrelevant in the face of his grim reality. But as the years went by and the weight of his isolation pressed on him, Emmanuel began to seek solace in religion. He found himself drawn to Christianity, particularly the teachings of forgiveness and redemption. He started reading the Bible, engaging in conversations with prison chaplains, and even participating in Bible study groups. His spiritual transformation was not immediate, but it provided him with a framework for understanding his past actions and for finding peace within himself. Emmanuel came to believe that he could never undo the harm he had caused, but he could at least live the rest of his life striving to be a better person, even if that life was spent in a prison cell. His relationship with his family was one of the few connections he had to the outside world, and over time it became more complex. His mother, though devastated by his crime, visited him regularly, offering what comfort she could. She had always hoped for a different life for her son, one far removed from the hardships and choices that led him to prison. Their visits were difficult, filled with an unspoken sadness, but also a quiet understanding that, despite everything, they still cared for one another. His younger siblings, now adults, were also part of his life, though their visits were less frequent as the years passed. They too had their own lives to live, and the emotional toll of having a family member on death row was something they struggled to navigate. One of the most profound changes in Emmanuel's life came through his advocacy work. As he spent more time reflecting on his actions, he also became increasingly vocal about the injustices he saw in the prison system and the broader criminal justice system. He began writing letters to lawmakers and journalists, asking for reforms to the death penalty and advocating for the recognition of inmates as human beings, regardless of the crimes they had committed. His own case, he realized, was part of a larger story of inequity, how the justice system often failed those who were most vulnerable, those like him who grew up in poverty and without the support needed to make better choices. While his advocacy could not change his past, it became a way for him to channel his remorse into something more constructive, pushing for systemic change even as he remained behind bars. As the years passed, the concept of clemency became a topic of discussion in the media and among advocacy groups. Emmanuel's case, along with others, was reviewed by the Oklahoma Pardon and Parole Board, and there was some movement toward potentially reducing his sentence. However, despite the recommendation for clemency, Governor Kevin Stitt chose not to intervene, and Emmanuel's fate was sealed. Still, the years of personal transformation had allowed Emmanuel to come to terms with his situation. He had spent his time on death row reflecting on his past, writing to his family and supporters, finding spiritual solace, and even advocating for a more just system for those who had been condemned. The execution, when it came, was a formal conclusion to a life already marked by a profound internal change, a change that had occurred not because of the system, but in spite of it. On the morning of September 26, 2024, Emmanuel Antonio Littlejohn faced his final moments. The 32 years he had spent on death row were a slow and painful unraveling of his life, filled with reflection, remorse, and quiet hope that somehow, someway, his story would be heard and his life spared. However, despite the years of appeals and the recommendations for clemency from those who believed in his transformation, the Oklahoma Pardon and Parole Board's request for a reprieve had been rejected by Governor Kevin Stitt. The decision was final, and Emmanuel's fate was sealed. The question that had hung over him for decades, would he be executed or given another chance, was now answered. The final day began early, just as it had for years. The sound of footsteps echoed down the long, cold corridors of the Oklahoma State Penitentiary. The world outside carried on while Emmanuel remained confined within the walls that had been his home for more than 3 decades. He was allowed time to pray, to reflect, and to make any final arrangements. The prison chaplain was present, offering spiritual support as Emmanuel prepared to face what was before him. His final hours were marked by an unusual calm, not born of indifference but from a hard-earned acceptance. Though Emmanuel had been given a chance to make his final statement, he was not alone in these moments. His family, though devastated by what had led them to this point, was allowed to be present, albeit from a designated area behind glass. His mother, who had stood by him through the trials and tribulations of his life, watched from the back, her face a mix of grief, pride, and love. Emmanuel's younger siblings, now adults with families of their own, had come to show their support. Though the pain of seeing their brother sentenced to death was a scar they would carry for the rest of their lives. Their faces reflected the agony of a family torn apart, each member grappling with the implications of Emmanuel's actions and their ongoing love for the person he had become over the years. Emmanuel's heart ached as he saw them, knowing the painful weight they would carry long after this day. In the hours leading up to the execution, Emmanuel had a moment to himself where he reflected on the journey that had led him to this moment. It was a journey that had been full of mistakes but also growth. He had gone from being a young man lost in a cycle of poverty, crime, and poor choices to someone who had spent the majority of his adult life contemplating his actions and the person he had become. In his solitude, he thought about Kenneth Mears, the man whose life he had ended in a senseless robbery gone horribly wrong. Though he had written and spoken about his remorse for years, it was in these final moments that the weight of that loss felt the heaviest. He had taken away someone's husband, father, and friend, and no amount of reflection could ever bring that person back. It was a truth he would carry with him as he walked toward his final moments. The clock ticked down. At 10 a.m., the guards entered his cell to begin the preparations for the lethal injection. They spoke to Emmanuel briefly, telling him it was time, and for the first time in years, he felt a sense of finality that seemed to both calm and fill him with dread. He had long understood that the death penalty was the price for his crime, but it was impossible to prepare for the moment when it would become a reality. His legs shook slightly as he walked down the corridor toward the execution chamber, but he kept his head high, walking with the dignity that had eluded him in his youth. He did not know exactly what to expect in his final moments, but he had made peace with the fact that this was the end of the road for him. Upon entering the chamber, Emmanuel was strapped to the gurney, and the cold, sterile environment felt like another prison, a final one beyond the concrete and bars of the penitentiary. The equipment and procedures that had become a part of the process for state executions were a stark reminder of the mechanical finality of his fate. He was given the chance to make a statement, and Emmanuel took a deep breath before speaking. He looked into the camera, which would broadcast his words to those watching from behind the scenes, his voice steady and calm as he spoke his final words to his family. "Everything is going to be okay. I love you," he said simply, his voice soft but clear. These words, spoken with a quiet confidence, were his parting gift to his family, a final message to reassure them in the face of the profound loss they would endure. Emmanuel's family, despite the agony of the situation, understood the sincerity in his words. They had seen the man he had become, and they knew that he had come to peace with his fate, even if that peace did not come easily. As the lethal injection process began, Emmanuel felt a sharp sting in his veins. The drugs flowed into his system, each moment bringing him closer to the inevitable end. His body began to relax, his breathing slowing, and for a brief moment he closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the years he had spent reflecting on his actions, his regrets, and his attempts to make amends. In the silence of that room, he drifted away, his last breath taken quietly. At 10:17 a.m., Emmanuel Antonio Littlejohn was pronounced dead. His execution, while the final chapter in his long and complex story, sparked renewed discussions about the death penalty in Oklahoma and across the United States. Emmanuel had spent more than 3 decades on death row, a significant portion of his life marked by profound personal change and reflection. His case had drawn the attention of advocates for criminal justice reform, many of whom argued that the justice system had failed to recognize his capacity for change and the possibility of rehabilitation. His transformation, both as a person and as a symbol of the complexities of the justice system, remained part of the ongoing conversation long after his death. For Emmanuel's family, the pain of his execution was impossible to quantify. They had watched him grow, not just from a young man on a path of destruction, but into someone who understood the depths of his crime, sought redemption, and tried to atone for his past. They had loved him, despite everything, and in the end they would remember not just the crime he committed, but the person he had become, a person shaped by years of suffering, reflection, and ultimately a search for peace. As the media coverage of the execution faded into history, Emmanuel's story remained a poignant reminder of the intersection between crime, punishment, and the possibility of change. His final words would live on in the hearts of those who knew him, a testament to the love that could still exist even in the most painful of circumstances, and a reminder that the human capacity for growth, even under the harshest conditions, is a complex and enduring force.